This is my 145th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is just a little rolling stock kit build, specifically of a MAJ Models kit for a Lancashire and Yorkshire Railways 20-ton coal wagon. Basically, I spent the week building this kit pretty much as therapy, as I was tired and discouraged as a result, amongst other things, of struggling with loco models that I couldn't really get to work as I wanted. And I thought it would be good just to spend some time making something with my hands. I picked up this kit among several others at the recent Great British Train Show in Brampton, Ontario, Canada, not too far from where I live. A vendor had a box full of these kits and was offering them for $1 each, except for some Pico wonderful wagon kits for which he was asking $4. None of the Pico kits actually fitted my prototype of LMS operations before World War II, but most of the MAJ kits did, and also a Parkside Dundas brake van kit, which I already built in part 128 of this series. So these kits were beyond excellent value for money, and in hindsight I only regret that I didn't buy more of them. Here's the back of the kit before I opened it. This particular kit actually turned out to be missing the wheels that were supposed to be included. I didn't notice that when I bought it, or even at this point. The back of the sheet stapled to the top of the bag illustrates how the wagon would have been marked in Lancashire and Yorkshire use, in early and late LMS use, and in British Railways use, although it actually says BP. These wagons were built for the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, which merged with the London and North Western Railway shortly before the general amalgamation of 1923. The LNWR then merged into the LMS in 1923, so these wagons became LMS stock. Some of them continued in use long enough to pass to British Railways upon nationalisation in 1948. There is a note at the bottom of this page about body assembly. In hindsight, having now completed assembly of the kit, I would say that this note is misleading and doesn't make much sense in terms of the realities of the kit. Small brass parts for axle bearings and buffer heads came taped to the instruction sheet inside the bag, although obviously this kit was made a long time ago and the tape had pretty much perished. Here's the introductory instruction text. Quite a number of options are offered for building the kit, and it all gets a bit confusing, especially given that the actual assembly instructions are rather cursory. The instructions suggest assembling the kit using mech pack. I have no idea what that might be. I used poly cement throughout and it worked fine. Here are the brass parts freed from the tape and cleaned, 4 bearings and 4 buffer heads, all present and correct. Here are all of the plastic parts that came with the kit. The body, sides and ends were separate and everything else came on a single sprue. It seems that the sprue is designed to build a wagon chassis with various possible options, 10-foot 6-inch or 12-foot wheelbase, vacuum braked or hand braked only. So not all parts will be used, depending on which version you go for. I assume that this same chassis sprue would be used in kits with different upper wagons. Here are the instructions, not really all that clear, especially since the one exploded diagram is trying to cover both vacuum-fitted and hand-braked versions, which are very different in many ways. The text, at least, is clearly split into instructions for the vacuum-fitted and handbrake versions, although the paragraph underneath the paragraphs numbered 1 and 2 is actually part of instruction 2 for the vacuum brakes, which is hardly clear from the way it's printed. Here is the floor of the wagon detached from its sprue. The little circles on the end are not part of the floor, those are intended as part of the buffers, but I detached them from the sprue along with the floor as this seemed safest. I didn't use a saw to detach parts from the sprue as suggested in the instructions, but rather did all detaching with a sharp knife. This did require considerable care in order to avoid damaging some of the finer parts. There's a mounting for a coupling cast into one end of the floor. The coupling mount at the other end will be attached as a separate part, For shorter versions of the wagon, the length of the floor would need to be cut down. I decided to make a full-length version of the wagon, as this seemed more unusual and more interesting. I also decided to go with handbrakes only, honestly largely because the assembly for the vacuum brake version was way more complicated, so much so that I could hardly understand it, and I figured it wouldn't really be easy to even see the difference when the wagon was running. Also, most of the other freight stock I have is not vacuum fitted. I cut the little circular parts for the buffers off the floor part and put them into a tray with the brass parts. It's very hard to get parts this small really clean, as they're too small to really hold them to sand or file. I looked at the parts for the wagon walls and floor. I should have looked at everything more carefully and thought a bit more, as I got rather misled by the chassis instructions. You'll see what I mean in a bit, unless you get there ahead of me. The instructions just deal with assembling the chassis with no reference to the body other than the note that we saw at the top sheet. This led me into some confusion, and the chassis instructions as printed won't really work entirely with the body parts as supplied. I didn't realise this, so I just followed the chassis instructions as given, based around this diagram. Again, you have to remember that this diagram is trying to show the parts for both the vacuum-fitted and the handbrake versions, so it's pretty confusing. Separate long and short sole bars are provided. I prepared the long bars as I was making the longer version of the wagon. The two sides are different. I believe they also need to be modified a bit for the vacuum-fitted version. There are holes on the insides of the sole bars into which pins on the axle hangers are fitted. Here are the 4 axle hangers. The one at top right came with a bit of damage, but I don't think it'll be very noticeable. This kit was supposed to come with metal wheels and axles, but they were missing from this example. I used some wheels from another kit. These are actually wheels that came with the Parkside Dundas brake van kit, which I built, but I ended up using different wheels for it. I inserted the brass bearings into the holes in the axle boxes. Basically, I just fitted the ends of the bearings to the holes and then squeezed them down into place with needle nose pliers. The fit of the hangers to the sole bars is quite positive, as the pins or lugs on the hangers fit into the holes on the sides of the sole bars. Here are the sole bars with their axle hangers fitted. The sole bars then glue to the sides of the wagon floor. There's a step against which they butt, and the extensions of the hangers glue flat to the floor, giving additional stability. The ends of the sole bars just go flush with the ends of the floor. There's nothing else to fix the alignment lengthwise. Here are both sole bars in place. The instructions did say to fit the axles at the same time as doing this, but I just popped the axles into the bearings afterwards, which wasn't hard to do. The instructions say to fit the buffer beams next, so I did what they said. Here are the buffer beam parts after cleaning up. For some reason, the buffer beams for the two ends are made slightly different, with their locating lugs at different heights. This seems to be an offshoot of the coupling mount being cast in at one end but separate at the other. It actually seems to serve no useful purpose. Even allowing for the different lugs, I didn't find that the buffer beams really fitted properly. I had to square off the sides of the lugs to get the beams to fit. And when I came to fit the part for the second coupling mount, I ended up cutting off the lugs on that beam entirely so that I could fit that coupling mount properly. And now there's another train going by outside. Here's what I had at this point: a wagon floor with buffer beams and working axles, but no brake fittings yet. Trying to figure out how the brake fittings were supposed to go was not simple. I never did really get to understand the instructions for the vacuum-fitted version, but I didn't try that hard as I wasn't making that version. These are two parts for the brake shoes. The exploded diagram makes it look as though there should be three parts, but I think they've just shown one part split into two for some reason, or maybe you're supposed to cut one part in two for the vacuum-fitted version. So far as these two parts are concerned, clearly you have to use the one that fits with the spacing of the wheels for your version of the Wagon for the hand-operated brakes, so I needed the longer one and the shorter one wouldn't be used. Here's the part of the exploded diagram dealing with the brake fittings. If you can make sense of all this, you're ahead of me. I can say that parts 11, 13, 14 and 15 apply only to the vacuum-fitted version and so didn't apply to my assembly. Here I've tentatively fitted the longer part with brake shoes between the wheels, and it seems to fit okay. The piece at the bottom is part 12, which is supposed to be a sort of axle bar that goes between the two brake hangers on the left and right sole bars, and between the sole bars passes through the hole in the part with the brake shoes and through a similar hole in another small levering part that I hadn't yet found when I took this picture. The problem was that there was absolutely no way that part 12 as supplied was going to do any of that passing through holes. Part 12 wasn't even round, it was closer to square, and it was much too big to pass through the holes. I gave up on part 12 as supplied and instead cut a piece of 30 thou styrene rod to the right length. That was at least actually round. I still had a devil of a time getting it through all of the holes in the parts, even when I drilled the holes out a bit. The white piece you see here is the piece of styrene rod that I cut. I did eventually manage to do it and to get the parts in place, although I broke the little lever part at one point while struggling to get things into alignment along the rod, and so I had to repair that, and it's not quite straight. You can see up front center here my repair. The operating lever for the handbrakes then needed to be attached. I really struggled to see exactly how this was supposed to go on. I think this is about right. The left end has got to be on the bottom of the brake hanger, as it would actually be turning that small lever part in the middle. There wasn't any actual point of attachment for the other end of the operating bar on the sole bar, so I just vaguely glued it on where it came. Here's the other coupling mount. I had trouble getting this into place as the lugs on the back of the buffer beam got in the way, and I ended up cutting those off. Here's the bottom of the chassis after all of that assembly. Next, the buffers and coupling hooks needed to be fitted. I lost one of the coupling hooks trying to get it off the sprue. It pinged away as I cut it off and I couldn't find it. Tiny little thing. I bodged some kind of replacement using a bit of one of the unused brake parts. The brass buffer ends were passed through the little plastic ring parts and then glued into the holes in the buffer stems on the beams. The holes were actually way too small for the stems of the brass parts, so I measured the brass parts with calipers and then used a suitably sized drill bit in a pin vise to open out the holes. At this point I realized that I had a fairly serious problem. The chassis assembly was now finished as per the instructions given for a long handbrake chassis. But when I came to look at attaching the body, I realized that the body ends as supplied included buffer beams. So if I was going to use the body ends as provided, I shouldn't have put the buffer beams onto the chassis. Nothing in the instructions indicated this. It seemed to me that I had two choices. I could either try to take off the buffer beams from the chassis or cut the buffer beams off the wagon body ends. Taking the buffer beams off the chassis would be tricky, as I would also need to try to detach the coupling hooks and buffers for reuse. So I decided that it would be preferable to cut the buffer beams off the body ends. I scored deeply with a knife along a steel ruler and then did the actual cutting with a cutting disc in a rotary tool. The result was a bit rough, but I aimed the cut a little low to give me room to tidy things up by sanding and filing. I glued one of my modified ends to one of the sides, taking care to get things the correct way up. I proceeded to assemble all four sides of the body in this way. And then after it was all assembled, I glued the whole body to the chassis. It didn't fit too badly, considering that I wasn't doing it at all the way the kit intended. Next I painted the body light grey as standard for early LMS wagons. It seems that the standard practice for LMS wagons painted grey was for the buffer beams and soul bars to be black. However, there are photos showing buffer beams and or soul bars apparently painted grey, so really you couldn't say that any combination is definitely historically wrong. I decided to stay with black buffer beams and soul bars as perhaps the most standard. I did one side and one end first, and let those dry, basically just because it was hard to handle otherwise. And then I did the other side and the other end. I thought this paint was acrylic. Most of the paint I have in jars like this is acrylic, but when I tried to clean the brush in water, the paint wouldn't come off, and it turned out this was actually an oil-based paint. It was a little thicker than ideal, and so tended to rather obscure the fine planking lines. I left the paint to dry overnight before attempting to decal the wagon. I wanted large LMS letters and running numbers and load weight markings. I used an HMRS pressfix set for the lettering, but that set only provided numbers as individual digits, and trying to make up 5 or 6 digit running numbers from tiny individual digits is, for me at least, extremely difficult. So I used a Model Master water slide set for the running numbers and load markings. Here are the Model Master water slide decals for the running numbers and load markings cut out and ready to be applied. Given that the decals themselves are white, I can't imagine why Model Master produced them on a background that is almost white, as it makes them extremely hard to see and cut out. Here are the pressfix decals for the lettering. The trick with pressfix decals is to cut through the top carrying tissue layer without cutting through the backing card. The corner of the tissue can then be teased up with the point of a knife and the decal pulled away from the backing using tweezers. In this case I needed to apply each letter separately. I used some black paint to colour the buffer ends and also that white styrene rod I used in assembling the brakes. I picked out 2 couplings. I've been using these wide Bachmann couplings as my standard for fitting to kits, as they can be fitted to most kits either using the coupling mounts that come with the kit or using Pico's coupling mount blocks. I did need to drill out the holes in the couplings a bit to get them to go onto the mounts of this kit. With the holes drilled out, I push-fitted the couplings onto the mounts and they seemed quite firm without gluing. So now I had my wagon pretty much ready to run, just needing the decals. I used microset to help with the water slide decals, just brushing on a little microset, soaking the decals for about a minute in water, then sliding them into place using the point of a knife and tamping down and drying with the end of a cotton bud. Here are the running number and load marking on the corner of one side of the wagon. Then I applied the pressfix decals for the letters, starting with the M in the middle. The plank lines were used to keep the letters aligned. As indicated by the name, the pressfix decals are just positioned and then pressed down. Then the backing is wetted. I use a cotton bud dipped in water, and then the backing can be slid off. Here's the other side of the wagon after decaling. A bit more of a close-up. My painting isn't exactly precise and there are some glue marks visible, but I don't think it will look too bad running. I did want to add a load to this wagon, so I got out some coal for that purpose. I also got out some lead shot to add weight. I put a layer of number 6 lead shot on the bottom of the wagon. Then I poured coal on top of that. I didn't fill the wagon all the way up to the top. Next I sprayed rubbing alcohol onto the load to wet it. This is necessary to get the glue to sink in. Without wetting, the glue will just tend to bead on top. Then I applied watered down white glue using a pipette. This is just standard white glue diluted, 1 part of glue to a bit more than 1 part of water. I thoroughly soaked the load with the watered down glue. This will hopefully hold the load in place when the glue dries. Finally, I masked the wheels so that I could spray some acrylic fixative onto the sides of the wagon to protect the decals. I left the glue and decals to dry for a day before the final spray with clear matte acrylic fixative. Well, it says matte on the can, it doesn't seem all that matte to me. To give this wagon a run, I got out a Wagon Ginty that was still in its box. I do have several Ginties, but this one turned up locally here in Canada at a reasonable price, so I picked it up. It was imported by Model Railway Imports, but they're out of business now. I believe that Nigel of British Model Trains bought out their remaining stock. This model just came with very simple paperwork, a parts diagram and a couple of basic notes on care. It was packed in the standard modern block of ice packaging. No detail pack came with it. Not super fancy, but quite a nice little model. Quite a decent weight, too. I got it onto my little test track to check its running first. It ran fine in both directions. The flash shows up the chassis under the boiler here, which doesn't look quite right, but I don't think it will be noticeable in normal light. I got the model onto my Hornby layout to run it in. Perhaps not necessary, as it wasn't exactly new, but I figure it's pretty much always best to run locos in when I get them. I used the baby monitor that I bought for this purpose to monitor the running in. That way I can sit at my desk and get on with other things, but be ready to jump in if there's any problem with the running in. In this case, I ran the Ginty in for 30 minutes forward and 30 minutes backward with no incident at all. Having run in the Ginty, I coupled up the newly built wagon. I didn't go for much of a train, just another coal wagon in front and a brake van behind. Here's the newly built wagon coupled in that train. That didn't work too well, actually, as the new wagon has a rather short or rather set back coupling and rather long buffers. The wagon I coupled in front was also kit-built, though not by me. They couldn't really get round curves due to the buffers of the two wagons locking as the couplings held them so close together. So I ended up switching to a different wagon in front. That wagon didn't have the buffer locking issue. Actually, that wagon, also kit-built, not by me, has one of its buffer ends missing, but it'll do for now. So now a little running video. Okay, let's just try and see a little bit of running of this wagon, this oversized ex-Lancashire and Yorkshire coal wagon that I just built from the kit. Well, let's see if it's running. We can see it running in a train now. Now I've switched out the wagon in front of it. Had some problems getting it to couple. I didn't have any problems with getting it to couple to the Hornby brake van that's behind it, but he does tend to have... He's got rather long buffers and rather short couplings, so if you're not careful, he can get buffer lock with the wagon in front of him. That's also another kit build. I'm surprised how many kit built wagons I have. I didn't build that one. It's not one I built, but it is a kit built wagon in front of him. It's actually missing one of its buffer heads, but I think it'll run okay. We'll see. Let's try now. So we'll increase the power on the Ginty and we'll go up to, about 45% power. And we hope that nothing derails now. I did derail. Oh yes, that's derailed again. I don't understand. I really don't understand why that Hornby brake van keeps derailing. It seems to be railed perfectly stably, and I can't imagine what's derailing it, but we'll maybe change to a different brake van. Well, that was a Hornby made in China brake van, a large brake van that I hadn't modified in any way. The only thing was it was the lightest thing in the train, because the loco and the other two wagons have weight, and the loco's reasonably heavy. Because not fairly heavy loco, that Wagon Ginty. So if there was a piece of garbage on the tracks, it would have been more prone to derail that than anything else. I just had to go. I just did vacuum the tracks between times just to make sure. So let's try again now. So say, as I say, now this is a Hornby made in Britain van, but I have modified it, I guess. I think it was originally a bauxite one, and I've decalled it, I think. I get confused as to what I've done sometimes, but I think that's my painting and decalling. I think I repainted that as a grey one and decalled it. Didn't modify it in terms of the wheels or the weight or anything. And it's an old one, as I say. It's a Hornby made in Britain grey van, that one. Anyhow, let's try again. I'm going to go up to 50% more or less. Sorry. It's hard to do the camera work and watch and adjust the speed of the train and everything. Oh, look at those wagons. We are getting maybe a little wobble on those wagons. I find kit-built wagons often seem to wobble a bit even when they're quite heavy. Perhaps the wheel flanges on those wheels are a little on the large side, so the wheel flanges may be catching on something a bit. It's a heavy wagon though, that one I just built from the kit. I put a lot of lead in it. I put a whole layer of lead in it underneath the real coal. I put a complete layer of lead, and lead's heavy stuff, and it's a large wagon, so it's a fairly large layer of lead. But anyway, the main point of this is to demonstrate that wagon, and I think he's running. Now that I've persuaded him to couple properly to something, he does have, as I say, rather short. He has those Bachmann couplings that I just happen to have on hand as my standard couplings to install on things. And they're a bit on the short side, and his buffers, his brass buffer heads that came with the kit are a bit on the long side, so he needs to couple to something else with a moderately long couple, well, longer couplings and shorter buffer heads, so that he can manage to, actually couple without getting buffer lock going around the corners and things. But so long as that happens, he seems to run fairly okay. And we're going forwards here, so I'm actually going to bring him through the level crossing there, and we'll halt him. So there you go. As a kit build, which is really the point of this, I'm fairly happy with this wagon. I think it came out quite well.